A part of what I want to clarify as we begin today is what I mean by soulmates and why I think this work is so important. And I'll give a little overview of what we're gonna talk about. We're gonna talk about um, soulmates and relationships as taught by Jeffrey Wolf Green. This is a really unique perspective, both on the relationship itself, in terms of how astrology looks at relationships, and it is also unique to evolutionary astrology. So if you don't have any experience with evolutionary astrology, I'll try and give a little basic foundation for us to work with. And I'll mention that at pretty much everything I'm going to teach in this class today can be referenced in the Pluto 2, Volume 2 book, which is entirely devoted to the soul's evolution through relationships. And the word soulmate is often used, especially in what we would call like I don't know, twin flame or spiritual relationship kind of language, but it's used very specifically by Jeffrey Wolf Green to describe one of several different relationship dynamics. Um, in this talk today, we're also going to talk a little bit about why the soul creates relationships, and we'll also cover evolution and the relationship. And then I'll use two charts, two different relationships, or one singular person with two different relationships, giving a demonstration of composite and synastry with both of those relationships. And yes, Jeffrey Wolf Green wrote the Pluto 2 book. It's the second volume to Pluto 1, which is the basic foundation in evolutionary astrology. So just to give a basics ground of what evolutionary astrology looks at, primarily Jeffrey Wolf Green started the Pluto paradigm, which is essentially saying that Pluto in the natal chart is a representation of the soul. We're all souls born into a body and having, many lifetimes, essentially, that we're working out karmic dynamics in these various different lifetimes. How do we work out karmic dynamics? Right? The soul engages in relationship in order to work out dynamics in its life. No one is born into a vacuum. We're all born into a family, and then we have, relationships from early childhood on into adulthood. And they are not just romantic relationships. The way soulmates is often used, it's a term that's used mostly to refer to romantic relationships, but actually I would consider that any kind of relationship can be a soulmate relationship, and any kind of relationship can be a karma mate relationship. In evolutionary astrology, Pluto is seen as the bottom light of the soul. So in the Pluto paradigm, we're looking at the natal position of Pluto, the sign and house that it's in. And, Pluto moves on a 248-year orbit. So I also think of this from my own perspective as being deeply generational and ancestral. And if you think about it, it is our ancestors who informed and created the way in which we came here into this world. And without their karmas, right, we wouldn't be born into a specific environment and place and time. So I don't believe personally that you have to believe in past lives in order for this material to be deeply relevant, and also um, something that can be incredibly helpful, whether you use it, in your practices in astrology, or you explore this for your own personal work. And part of the reason I consider myself an intuitive evolutionary astrology is that since the beginning, when I started studying astrology, I didn't exclusively study evolutionary astrology. Some of my teachers were Hellenistic astrologers, ancient astrologers, modern astrologers. I studied with Vedic astrologers. I have a Gemini moon. So gathering information and learning from all the different original sources of astrology has helped me to inform a basis. And I predominantly practice evolutionary astrology. But often when I'm with the natal chart, I discovered that I began to be able to channel information in the chart through my own perception. And that has really helped me to develop a framework around seeing trauma in the natal chart and understanding core dynamics that are happening. And so I bring that in as well, in addition to predominantly using the teachings of Jeffrey Wolf Green at this point in my life to direct and guide the way I'm looking at the natal chart. So with this Pluto as the bottom line for the soul's evolution, the soul is working with two very specific dynamics: desire, and desire is expressed through resistance and cooperation, right? We're all born into the world and we have a desire to, eat and breathe and be connected. But as we evolve, the soul has very specific desires to be expressed in its lifetime. And these desires are expressed through relationship. It's rare, even if we're not in a relationship at this moment, for the soul to not be working with desires that are ultimately have a necessity to be expressed through relationship. In the Pluto paradigm, one of the other core signatures of the paradigm is the use of the lunar nodes. The North Node signifying the evolutionary growth or development of the soul in this lifetime, and the South Node representing the sort of karmic past and fruitive dynamics that we're bringing in from past lifetimes. And then we would look at also the rulers of those nodes. Specifically, when we're looking at composite charts, we're also going to be looking at Pluto, the nodes, Venus, and Mars. And I'll cover that in our chart examples today. He specifically taught about 5 different types of relationships: the codependent relationship, the counselor-counselee relationship, the student-teacher relationship, the sadomasochistic relationship, and the self-sufficient relationship. And I would say that the self-sufficient relationship, in a sense, is it's sort of the offset or the opposite to the codependent relationship in a way. And within those 5 relationship types, he looked at 4 variations: karma mates and soulmates, same soul and twin souls, and souls in different evolutionary stages. And you would also use in evolutionary astrology kind of a basis of what the evolutionary stage is for those individuals in order to really, look at and make assessments around the dynamics of the soul. And those levels of consciousness, the evolutionary states, are consensus, individuated, and spiritual on the most basic level. So there are sub levels within those levels. So what are soulmates and karma mates? He refers to soulmates, or the real purpose of soulmates, as to continue their individual spiritual development because of and through relationships. Karma mates, he says, can be both positive and negative in any type of relationship, and at a soul level simply create the conditions necessary to facilitate our evolutionary progression. We're all responsible for our own actions. But what I want to make around these two distinctions, because soulmates is often used, to refer to like romantic relationships where we feel a sense of deep attraction to someone. Um, in this case, soulmates are not that per se. And karma mates are not necessarily karmic relationships that have difficult outcomes entirely. Soulmates, the difference predominantly between a soulmate and a karma mate relationship is the conscious choice to evolve together. So, that being said, if we are in a relationship, let's say, for example, a work relationship or a romantic relationship or a family relationship, and one individual is aware of the dynamics in the relationship, working on themselves, working on their triggers, their fears, their own personal challenges with the relationship, and the other person is not, we would consider that a karma mate relationship. It has to have the consent or the conscious choice of both individuals to actively continue their own individual spiritual development through the relationship for it to be considered a soulmate relationship. And that is a very different stance. It's two people who are consciously seeing the relationship and taking personal responsibility for the dynamics in the relationship, but choosing consciously to heal together. And this, I think, is a more rare experience and often one that we, on a soul level, long for more deeply. That, most other relationships that we're engaged in. But again, like I had an example the other day of two friends who booked a reading with me, and it was the first time I had experienced two people really wanting to understand the nature of their relationship, their synastry and the composite chart, because both individuals wanted to benefit from the development of the relationship. And they wanted to know how and what they could do and be and create together, right? This is different from coming to an astrologer because you want to know whether you're going to marry this person or if this person is a compatible match to you, right? It's fundamentally coming from a bottom line basis that you're responsible for your own evolution, regardless of whether somebody cooperates with you. Oftentimes, I think that we are born into karma mate families or karma mates within our families, whether it's siblings or parents or extended family, where those relationships at a soul level facilitate the necessity of our evolution, right? They push us in a way. And if we make the mother or the father or the brother or the uncle or the grandparents responsible for our own evolution, we'll be in a place of being victimized, resentful, hurt, and challenged by those relationships for our lifetime. But if we see at a soul level, you know, that this relationship is here for my soul's development, um, it would essentially be then in our own responsibility to orient ourselves towards that relationship. I can think of an example in my own life. My father and I have had a very difficult relationship since I was a little girl. And my father is deeply religious, born again Christian, and, has a perception that astrology is forbidden from a biblical perspective and that I'm living my life outside of God. And I would say that evolutionary astrology has done nothing but actually develop and deepen my relationship to God, actually, because from a bottom line perspective, Pluto and the core desire of the soul, which is what I actually really believe, is the soul's desire to return to its source. And I personally believe that source is God, and that our and that is love, and that is what all souls desire to return to. And the karmic dynamics in our life and the things that we bring forward are all pushing us evolutionarily either in resistance to that desire to return to source or in cooperation to that desire. And that happens through relationship. And so, actually, through my relationship with my father, I have developed a deeper and deeper love, both for really trying to understand what the karmic dynamics are in our relationship and at the same time forgive. And I woke up from a dream the other night that just said, this is a good time to forgive your mother and your father, which I thought was really interesting. I'm like, okay, I can I can accept that message. Um, and what he's done for me is that I've had to learn to find my own truth. And as I've done that, I've been able to claim my identity as an astrologer and step forward into the work that I feel called to do. It has facilitated evolutionary progression for me. And years ago, I didn't even want to be known personally by my name. I wanted to be, many of the astrologers that I know and love and appreciate are anonymous people. But I made the choice to come forward and to speak my truth and to continue to test that against the litmus test of whether I still feel that connection to God and to love and ultimately to my own soul's purpose. So that's an example of that. Versus in relationship, being in a conscious relationship with someone who, yeah, I'm saying my father is a karma mate. Yeah, definitely. Um, that I'm in a relationship with someone who is actively choosing their evolutionary journey with me. And both of us are committed to our own spiritual development because of and through the relationship. So I've also experienced this personally in relationship to be able to really come into a place of evolution through both lenses of relationship. And I think we encounter both types of relationships throughout our lives because the bottom line of every soul's journey is evolution. Once I received a message in ceremony that said, the real purpose of every relationship is to return us to our source. And if you think about that, the most difficult relationships that we face, whether intimate or friendships or work or family, those relationships ultimately lead us back to our source. If we have to learn from them, we have to come back to ourselves. We have to come back to a deeper relationship to our own personal actions. We can certainly live in those relationships in a place of victimization for a very long time. And you'll see this from our chart example. But ultimately, once we choose to be responsible for our own spiritual development or our own personal development, even if we're in a karma mate relationship, we can still evolve. Even if that person chooses completely never to change, never to evolve in their own behaviors, we can claim that for ourselves. And if we do get the benefit, the beauty of development through a relationship, where we can be mutually met with another person committed to their own evolution, that I think does quite a lot to further our evolution, but we don't have to have those relationships in order to evolve. We are evolutionary beings in one sense or another. The desire to return to source is always going to be operating within us, no matter what we choose. So he says, why do we create relationships? Um, from the book, we initiate relationships with a diversity of people in order to discriminate. He uses the word inconjunct, which is an aspect I'll explain the inconjunct in the chart, between those people who reflect what we need versus those people who do not. This specific quote is also relating to the Libran dynamic, right? Libra as an archetype is ruled by Venus, and Aries, its opposite, is ruled by Mars. Um, when we have this Aries, Mars, Libra, Venus oppositional energy, it's really the discrimination between what I want, I need, my desires, individual will, and we, collective will, our relational field. And a part of the dynamic of Libra, how we're learning through relationship, I'll speak about the inconjunct in a moment, is that we are learning about what we need, what we value, through people who reflect what we need and what we value, and people who do not. So it's a sort of like a comparison, contrast energy, because part of the dynamic within Libra can be the suppression of one's own needs in the face of relationship. Jeffrey Wolf Green would call that the codependent aspect. And what we're doing within that relationship is we're trying in some way, shape, or form to find a way to meet our needs. The inconjunct that you would speak about is the inconjunct that is experienced between the second house and the seventh house. And the second house being self possession, self responsibility, and the seventh house being the relationship, right? This is the inconjunct that in the natural zodiac is between Taurus and Libra, or second house, seventh house. When we're looking at the chart of an individual, or a composite chart especially, we're looking for the purpose of the relationship. And I'm not talking about purpose from the perspective of like, are these people meant to be together? Are these people not meant to be together? Because that's not, when people come to me for a relationship reading, that's not something I'm looking for. I don't have any distinction over God's will or over the will of another in relationship, right? We talked about karma mates versus soulmates. It's really the expression of our free will in relationship. The purpose of relationship is what is the soul's evolutionary expression in relationship, right? So that is a different thing than whether this is a good person to marry, or this is a good person to date, or this is a good person to, have a family with, right? I don't look for those types of purposes when I'm looking at the chart. Although you can see from the planets that interact, oh, yeah, this could possibly be something that you do in this lifetime. Plenty of people have children with karma mate relationships. I would describe my parents, conception and relationship to me as a karma mate dynamic. They did not both want to evolve in the relationship, and they had children. So, it's not that only soulmates have children, or, a lot of that is, you know, um, a lot of the purpose of our relationships, at least from an evolutionary perspective, is based on what the soul's ultimate desires are. And just to speak to the Pluto in Libra in the seventh house, Jeffrey Wolf Green has an entire chapter here on Pluto in Libra in the seventh house in this book, under the phasal, under the relationships of Venus. So you can definitely learn more about the placement of that. But Pluto is the core power and desire of the soul for evolution. So Pluto in Libra in the seventh house, of course, you're going to be learning that very, very discrimination that I was talking about. around what we need and what we value in relationship versus what is yours to do, right? What is yours? What is your will? What is your work? And so from an evolutionary perspective, there's a soul level desire, and then you would need to look at where the Venus is, where the Mars is, where the nodes are, what the aspects are between those things to more deeply understand that Pluto in Libra in the 7th house. Excuse me. So looking at the Pluto, these are the key chart signatures that we're looking at in evolutionary astrology. Looking at the sign and the houses, although if you're missing or have an inaccurate time of birth, the houses will be inaccurate. And so just to keep that in mind. Aspects and phases. And phases are often used in evolutionary astrology. They are used to describe the evolutionary intention between the planets based on when and how they're in relationship to one another. So, for example, from a lunar cycle perspective, right now we are in a balsamic phase. The moon is closing its cycle, both with the south node, and it's currently closing its cycle, lunar cycle, before we have this new moon eclipse in the sign of Libra. I've been talking about this on my YouTube channel. I do a weekly video and a monthly video, and I do special reports. And I recently did a special report called Love Evolution on the Venus-Pluto phases that are happening right now through the end of the year. But very specifically, this particular phase that we're in is a culmination, a fruition, a completion of long-standing relationship dynamics, which is ultimately on the other side of this eclipse, starting a new phase of relationship in that Libra house. So for example, for that 7th house Libra person, this eclipse could be in the 7th house. This could be an entirely new phase of evolution relative to the core desires of the soul just taking root at this time. And what's similar about both the balsamic phase and the new phase is that they're dark times, meaning we can't necessarily see what's happening. It's very internal and instinctual, but it's the place with which all these things take root. So we would look at aspects and phases in the chart, Mars and Venus, the 5th and 7th houses, and I would add also the 2nd house. Yeah. So if you have a yod, those are two inconjuncts, right? He was talking about the inconjunct earlier in the quote. The inconjunct is a very important aspect, and Pluto being at the apex of the inconjunct would make Pluto kind of the resolution or the hard stop, basically. And the legs of the inconjunct, the planets that would make up those legs, each one of those, to me, they're kind of like the worker bees, but they're not necessarily visible. The interesting thing about the inconjunct is that we can't necessarily see as clearly what the impact is of something. It's almost like having an itch on the back of your shoulder blade in the little spot where you can't quite reach it yourself. And I know they call it a finger of God because it's considered to be kind of a destined point. And I have a composite chart relationship with someone where we have an inconjunct that has Pluto and the moon and involves the 7th house. And it's definitely a destined, sort of fated relationship where we've worked out a lot of karmic dynamics in that relationship. So it's all of this stuff. I have an hour, to give a basic overview, but all of this stuff could be studied extensively, and applied to your own chart, applied to your own relationships. It's really, I mean, it's kind of endless, the possibilities that you can really look at these things. And a part of what I want to share is that when I'm mentoring apprentice astrologers or working with students, people who are learning about their own chart, I generally always use the chart of the individual. That's my teaching chart. If not that, then I'm using the chart of the present moment. So I'll sort of say that as a caveat because in this teaching, I'm going to use, and I only use midpoint composite for the composite chart. In this teaching, I'm going to use a celebrity chart, a celebrity who has passed away, and her two relationships, her two primary relationships. But when I'm working with students and individuals, I really believe so strongly in learning about evolution through our own evolution and through our own direct experience. And so being able to look at your own chart, being able to understand the core dynamics in your own relationships is truly, I think, the most valuable use of this work in our lives. And then, of course, if you're studying to be an astrologer, being able to help others understand. Because when someone comes to me and they want to see the synastry or, you know, have a relationship reading or work on something, to me, I'm working from the perspective of what are the desires of this soul and how is this relationship furthering those desires for evolution. And do I prefer? I personally prefer to use synastry first before composite because synastry, I can perspective it from the individual who's with me and the way that they're relating to the person that is in relationship to them. And really, unless two people are with me together, the composite chart is not um it's not uh necessarily going to work, right? Because I don't know if they're both going to cooperate with that evolutionary intention. It's hard to know. um Most of the time when I'm looking at a composite chart, it's in a relationship reading with both people. um and I certainly, if you email me, I can email you those slides. I'm happy to share that with you. Yeah. uh And personally, I see the synastry as being more indicative of what planets, if I'm talking to one individual, what planets they have that are interacting with the planets of another. So, if you have a Pluto, a Venus conjunction, right, that those core dynamics around self-value, self-love, love, worthiness, personal values, personal power are going to be interacting all the time in that relationship. You know that Pluto and Venus are going to be working together in the evolution between those two people, whether or not they choose to cooperate with the evolution, right? If they're not cooperating with it, if they're resisting it, those dynamics will seem, like quote unquote toxic relationship dynamics or challenging, really challenging power dynamics, right? If they are working together, if they are cooperating from that spiritual basis, those dynamics in relationship will be changing each person at a deep and fundamental way into a person more connected to their source, more connected to the love that they are, more connected to who they are. I would say what, like, their true nature, what they're here to do. They would be further the power that those two, that Pluto Venus conjunction and that synastry would be bringing forward what their souls both most deeply need in order to be met in this lifetime and to evolve through that evolution together. So it's a very different distinction, right? It could, um, I don't use Davidson just because I don't study it very much. I, it's just not, I use the midpoints. Jeffrey Wolf Green teaches on the midpoints. That's, the midpoint is the combination of the two charts together. It is the central sort of merger of those two souls in one chart. And, you know, I think for me that's relevant and it works. Um, and yes, I use each person's individual natal chart synastry between the two natal charts and then the composite chart, the midpoint composite chart. So, yeah. Okay, so we have, are there any other questions about charts or anything that I've said so far before I move on to our chart example? Composite with transits, of course. Yeah. And in one of the composite charts that I work with all the time, I notice when the moon is returning to the place of the composite moon, there is generally always an evolutionary movement that's happening in that relationship. It's really fascinating to witness and to track. It certainly transits to the composite chart can affect the relationship, can reflect different effects of things going on in the relationship, for sure. Okay. I use porphyry as a chart. My current chart preference. When I first started learning, and I learned with a lot of Hellenistic astrologers who, and folks who used whole sign houses, I originally was using whole sign, and then I tried Placidus for a while. Most of the evolutionary astrologers that I know use porphyry, and I have found that I'm able to detect more subtle nuances in the chart using a porphyry chart, that it has just kind of become my way of looking at the chart. Let's see.
Hi, Michelle. Are you still good for time?
I am. What do I got 15 minutes or something, just a bit. Yeah. I'm just trying to look through the chat and see if there are actually questions that I can answer.
Okay.
There was one in the Q&A. I just want to circle back and make sure it was answered. What house system did Green use and which one do you use?
He uses porphyry and I use porphyry. Yeah. As far as I know. There's charts in his books too. I'm pretty sure all of them are porphyry charts. The main thing I think that you have to be aware of with the charts, especially from an evolutionary astrology perspective, I guess if time of birth is missing or inaccurate, then you need to, you're working with the Pluto dynamics, but not necessarily the Pluto sign house dynamics.
There's another question, Michelle. Venus Pluto aspects and Mars Pluto aspects between two people often get a bad rep. Could you share some positive examples from your experience or practice?
Well, I'll show you also in this chart example. But it's sort of like I was speaking before about the distinction between the Venus-Pluto aspect being used constructively or being in a state of resistance to that aspect, right? Mars, Pluto, Venus, Pluto, Venus, Mars, right? These things that we would deem as challenging, I don't actually necessarily think they're challenging at all. I think everything is encouraging our own evolution. If we have personal patterns of codependency, if we have patterns of, being in abusive relationships, or if we witnessed family members, a lot of us grew up with a lot of negative conditioning around relationships or different things, right? And we get into a relationship where those core dynamics are brought to the surface. It is an opportunity for you as an individual in your free will with your choice to evolve and heal in those very dynamics. And you ultimately have a choice whether, you're the victim of a difficult relationship or whether you are healed and, sovereign and you grow and all different kinds of things can emerge. And so when we have planetary aspects, of course, it requires then the free will of the other person, which is the whole dynamic within a soulmate dynamic. When the free will of another person joins with our free will, and both individuals take responsibility for their part in the relationship, those planets can come together and lend immense power to the relationship. It can strengthen the ability to feel seen and to feel loved, to heal deeper childhood issues and wounding or patterns from the past, and that can ultimately fuel our growth and evolution in ways that we would have never otherwise been able to do on our own. And so I would say, regardless of whether it's a soulmate relationship or a karma mate relationship, it is a gift, right? And if we take it as such, and that's up to us, to determine how we relate to the relationships in our life, to what's happening to us, to what's happening through us, to what's happening for us. It's like these are different ways. I'm either something is happening to me and I'm the victim of this, right? Your birth, you're born into a physical environment. Maybe you're born into a alcoholic family system, and you had to immediately caretake, you know, narcissistic father who was raging and you constantly coping with instability in the family. And that then, of course, later in life, you're looking for a partner who is um, gonna fulfill the healing of that core imprint. And maybe your first love ends up being someone who's also a narcissistic, alcoholic, person who you have children with, and then is the father of your children, right? And then that core pattern is repeating until you learn your own emotional freedom and your capacity to detach from those codependent patterns. And let's say maybe you learn, you get help, you learn how to communicate, you learn how to take care of yourself, you become self-responsible for your own healing. And there's two scenarios there, right? Your husband could continue to be abusive and violent and angry and drunk, and you might have to make a sovereign choice to leave the relationship and take your children and do your healing work. It's interesting. I'm saying all this as I'm looking at Tina Turner's chart, which is very much her first relationship, right? And we'll look at her composite and synastry with Ike. And those choices are going to be difficult, but you are going to evolve through that. And with her, she became her relationship with Ike ultimately evolved her core calling as a singer. And secondarily, he gave her many children. She ended up even raising other children that he had fathered. She really came into her spiritual life as a result of leaving that relationship. right? Her own spiritual evolution came out of that difficult, abusive relationship. And the signatures are all there in her chart, right? Pluto in the 12th house, conjunct Chiron in Cancer. And we have a Saturn on the south node in Aries, ruled by Mars in Pisces in the 7th house. So, it was a part of her soul, I think, and her core evolutionary soul work. She has Venus in Sagittarius in the 5th house to learn how to be authentic, to learn how to speak her truth, to learn how to speak up for herself, to learn how to use her voice. And ultimately, her voice had so much power. And if you look, we'll look at the songs that she sang with this is their synastry. So he also had Pluto in Cancer. She was a Pluto in Leo. He had Pluto in Cancer. He had Chiron on her Uranus. His North Node was in her 8th house. She had a Mars Sun conjunction, right? With him. And he had a Sun in Scorpio in the 4th house, right? He had Venus in Scorpio in the 4th house, in her 4th house. So I look at the synastry from the perspective of her in the center of the wheel. And, the outside as, him. And this comment about, the reality of celebrity relationship dynamics. I can only speak to the soul dynamics here. And certainly what this evolutionary journey for them revealed. But a part of why I choose in my own professional work on my day-to-day teaching, mentoring, working with students and clients, um, and other astrologers, I use personal charts because only only in speaking to someone where we can actually like speak to the real evolutionary dynamic that they're experiencing is I mean, it's so hard with celebrities. You really can't know what was going on inside their life. You can know what was reported to the public. And so I always take that with a grain of salt. But it's very interesting here because if we take note of some of the planetary positions, so Mars was the ruler of her south node, Mars is the ruler of his north node. Her Let's see. Her Sun Mars conjunction, we don't have the time of his chart, which is why I'm not using him as the primary. We have the time of her chart. And so for the purpose of but one of the things about his chart without the time of birth, his moon is pretty firmly fixed in Virgo. There's a potential that if he was maybe even a couple hours later, time of birth, his moon in Virgo could have been in the 2nd house, which also would be a very appropriate synastry because so much of their relationship was this 2nd house, 8th house dynamic. They worked together. They made money together. They had a family together, right? So you can see that family life was very important, was a huge part of their relationship. They had a career path together, which you see in, I think you can close your chat and that will help you with that. Their relationship together was one that brought them a lot of wealth, right? Moon and Virgo in the 2nd house, but he lacked the discernment with their resources, and his moon in Virgo is conjunct his Neptune. He spent all their money. I mean, she left the relationship with no money to her name. And even when he died later on in his life was pretty much, broke as far as they reported, in the news media. And he was still in his addictions at that time as well. So, but she did end up being predominantly responsible for their children. And the majority, I would say, with this Pluto, both of these Pluto dynamics in the 12th house, the majority of their relationship dynamics were happening behind closed doors. So regardless of whether, it was passionate or abusive or entangled or whatever, a lot of it was not being seen by the public eye. But in their composite chart here, you can see they have Pluto in the 10th house in Cancer with the South Node. So this is a fruition of emotional dynamics that ultimately forced a separation and an individuation of her from this relationship, which really, was about her own emotional evolution. They had on, excuse me, if you look at their greatest hits, the titles, right? Venus in Sag in the second house, um, with Mercury, the titles of these albums: A Fool in Love, Poor Fool, I'm Jealous, Good Good Loving, Mind in a Whirl, Don't Play Me Cheap. You should you should have treated me right, right? But so much of it was the expression authentically of their creation together. They also had Saturn in Pisces in the 5th house. Like, there was a lot of struggle. His there was a lot of suffering in their relationship in general. And you see when you look at their children, I think, there was a lot of suffering that their children experienced as a result of being a part of this relationship as well. Yeah, they have Chiron in the 8th house in Gemini, a composite Jupiter in Gemini opposite that Venus. They became big. I read stories about, her jealousy over the way that Ike related to other women that sang with them, um just she held a lot of the responsibility of raising the children, and it was definitely a karmic dynamic. In the end, Ike never made any conscious choice to evolve with her, right? But there was strong evolution that happened as a result of this relationship. So she left Ike, and later on in her life, Tina Turner met Erwin Bach. He was her second husband. They were together for, I believe, over a decade before ever being married. She had to contend with a strong resistance because in order to leave the relationship with Ike, she had to express that sovereign freedom, right? Of her Venus in Sag. She had to, follow her own spiritual path. And she did. She became a devout Buddhist and, was on a spiritual journey. And then when she met Erwin, described it as this sort of love at first sight, but kept him as a lover and a friend and someone who, you know, became a dear companion to her, very dear companion to her. And they're over time. But you look at the synastry between the two of them, and what's interesting about it is that he also had the very same Mars in Sagittarius, conjunct her sun Mercury. He was also an executive that, you know, was in the music industry. He was invited one day by a music executive to pick up Tina from the airport, and that's how they met. And there's immediate sense of, being drawn to one another. He had Pluto in Leo, same as her. Again, his time of birth is missing, but hers is accurate. And their their Plutos, in a way, both had this core signature. So the core signature of Pluto in Leo, in just a most basic sense, is this core desire to be seen, right? And there is a sense of special purpose and destiny. And Irwin was a relationship where she was able to actualize that deeper purpose while simultaneously actualizing herself spiritually, you know. And he was someone, if you notice, a lot of his planets are in her sixth house. He has Sun, Chiron, Mercury. He was someone ultimately who gave his kidney to her, trying to save her life. And that was a big part of their relationship. They ultimately did marry, and he was with her until the very end of her death. Um, and they have a Venus Mars conjunction in Pisces, right? Versus, let's go back to Ike and Tina, where their Venus, his Venus Mars is on her sun. And, it's a very, his Venus was in Scorpio. Like, there was a lot of shadow and secrecy and issues with jealousy and possession and things like that in the nature of their relationship. And then with Irwin, his Venus was in Pisces, and their relationship dynamics were ultimately supportive of her spiritual path. This is, for me, why this example is an example of a soulmate relationship versus a karma mate relationship. They really worked together well. Um, yes, I do factor in Juno. I teach an entire class series on the goddesses called The Goddess Within. Right now I'm doing the Goddesses of the Revolution, which I'm teaching on Lilith, Black Moon Lilith, Eris, and Chariklo, but earlier in the year I did Juno and all the major I incorporate all the goddesses. You'll see Juno, Hygeia, Lilith, Ceres. I use Haimea, and sometimes I'll intersperse I use Vesta as a core goddess. Sometimes I'll add Diana, or I'll add other goddesses if I'm in a research process. And I do sometimes add the vertex, which in astrology, it's not so much used in evolutionary astrology, but in astrology in general, it's referred to as a soulmate point. And so sometimes I'll be sometimes I add fixed stars. A lot of what I'm using and utilizing in charts actively has to do with where I'm researching things at the time. So,
Michelle, sorry, I'm conscious of time.
yep,
We're able to start closing in for questions.
absolutely.
We'll do a
Yeah.
few questions and then we'll close.
Yeah. So anyways, to close with their composite chart, they shared a lot. They worked together a lot. They had a shared sense of purpose. You see Pluto in Leo in the fifth house. Their relationship was a joyful collaboration, friendship. It promoted, and you see that with the Venus in Aquarius also. They worked really hard together and created a life together um, that ultimately supported Tina in furthering her evolution. So, I think the bottom line of what's love got to do with it? Well, from a Pluto perspective, love is everything, has everything to do with it. That all relationships are, as a bottom line, returning us to that desire to return to source. And that evolution itself is always happening, but we have a choice to resist and relive, or to cooperate or surrender. And that all relationships will serve our evolution. So my prayer for you at the end of this time is that love be at the center of your choices as you relate to um, all relationships in your life. So, yes, the teaching is on my website and on my YouTube channel. You can find both the intro to Love Evolution, which is the Venus Pluto dynamic, and you can find the Goddess Within, and the complete class series is on my website as well, astrologywithmichelle.com. So, any other
Thank
questions?
you. That was incredible. Michelle, do you have a slide with your details on or not? Should I put them?
I think the first one had my
Yeah, if you put it up for us.
astrologywithmichelle.com.
Thank
If
you.
you are on my newsletter, you'll get notifications. I publish a weekly forecast that I do on YouTube at Astrology with Michelle, and I do a monthly overview, and sometimes I do special reports if there's a significant aspect, so like Venus Pluto reports and things like that.
Cool. So we will, for the sake of time, just ask maybe a couple of questions. I noticed that there were some personal questions, which I think I will direct them to you
Yeah.
personally, if they can come to you via email or through your
Yeah,
handles.
definitely. You can email me. I do a monthly advanced practice class for students who want to learn how to work evolutionary astrology in their personal practice with their own natal chart. So that's available on my website. I also teach a Foundations of Astrology class, which I'll be introducing Foundations Level 1 in January. Again, I'm wrapping it up for this year right now. And then I'll be doing an advanced foundations where we do composite and synastry. So that'll also be available in the new year.
Okay, amazing. So I'm looking at the Q&A box and I see that Lydia has asked a few questions. I'm going to pick maybe two. She
Sure.
says, thank you for a lovely lecture. This is very interesting. Are you destined, by the way, to never grow totally apart from a dysfunctional family with difficult family members?
Oh, no, I don't believe that to be true. I mean,
Oh, have you frozen?
I think
Sorry, Michelle, I think you've frozen on my.
forgiveness can always be possible.
Oh,
I'm not frozen to myself. Um,
okay. Can you repeat the last
can
bit
you still
again?
hear me?
Yeah, now, yes.
So, no, there's no aspect in our chart that we are, you know, gonna have to be with forever. And there's no relationship in our lives that we can't evolve from our own personal evolution. So definitely, even if there are very deeply entrenched family dynamics, even if there's been trauma in our life, even if there are difficulties that we face in karmic relationships, every single person, I think, has the potential to heal and to evolve. That I wouldn't be doing this work otherwise. Can it take a long time? Absolutely. Does it take a long time? Usually because our resistance to even letting go of those dynamics can be very strong. And sometimes we don't even know that there's something else possible for us until we do. And I think that comes with you know, free will and our choice. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then somebody asks, what degree of orb do you use for Pluto?
Depends on the aspect. Generally 3 degrees with conjunctions, sometimes up to 10 degrees.
Okay. Courtney, can you see anything in the chat that I've missed, maybe?
I think as Michelle was going, she was capturing a lot of the
I try to catch
questions.
Oh,
everything.
well
Yeah.
done. Good.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Any last notes? Because I think we'll leave it here in terms of the questions. That was incredible. You got me thinking about my father, by the way. I think he's definitely a karmic mate.
Well, we can definitely evolve with or without them. So,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
amazing. Well, on that note, I think we will close here. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Thank you
Thank
again,
you.
Dench, for an amazing presentation. And until next time, see you soon.